Hello everybody, welcome to the very last developer session of Rezzed 2017. I hope you've had a wonderful day out exploring the show and finding games. And hello also to the people on Twitch. I keep looking to the ceiling, I know you're not up there, but all the same. As you saw on the slide, the tickets for EGX in September are on sale. That's our event in Birmingham. I'm Bertie, a writer for Eurogamer, and it's my pleasure to introduce Bill Harms from Hangar 13 to talk about how 1968 shaped the world and characters of Mafia 3.
How's everybody doing? As you said, so the primary focus of this talk is going to be an exploration of the kind of research we did in terms of Mafia 3, both in terms of what was happening in 1968 in America, and also criminality. 1968 kind of signifies the end of the golden age for the Italian Mafia. So that's also part of the exploration that we did in the game. Before we get started, I just want to let everybody know that although there's no racist language in the presentation, it does discuss racist language, which was obviously a part of the game. So I just want to let everybody know about that up front. So Mafia 3. Mafia 3 was released on October 7th of last year for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC. And Mafia 3 is what we call a pulpy revenge thriller. You play as a man named Lincoln Clay, who's actually an orphan. He was abandoned by his mother around the age of 2, and he's raised in a Catholic orphanage by a man named Father James Ballard. When the orphanage closes, Lincoln is basically put out on the street. And at that point, he falls in with a man named Sammy Robinson, who heads up the black mob in a section of New Bordeaux, which is the city where the game is set. The section of that city is called Del Rey Hollow. Lincoln lives with Sammy and Sammy's biological son Ellis until the age of 18. And at that point, he enlists in the army and he's sent to Vietnam. He's in the armed military for 4 years. And during his time in Vietnam, he's recruited into the Special Forces. And that's where he meets a man named John Donovan, who I'll discuss later. When Lincoln returns home, what he finds out is Sammy owes the Italian Mafia a lot of money. Lincoln's original plan was to basically come home and say goodbye and move to California and start a new life. But he's very loyal to Sammy, who's essentially his father. So he decides to stay in town and help Sammy make things right. Unfortunately, they're betrayed by the Italian mob. The head of the Italian mob is a man named Sal Marcano. He kills Sammy and Ellis. And as you see here, that's Sal Marcano's son, Georgie. He shoots Lincoln in the head and leaves him for dead. And at that point, that's essentially the inciting incident for the game, and then it turns into Lincoln exacting revenge on the Italian Mafia. Like I said before, we consider Mafia 3 a pulpy revenge thriller. And although there's a lot of elements of race discussions and racism in the game is not about racism. However, because of Lincoln's race and background, it essentially permeates every aspect of who he is as a man and informs not only how he views the world, but also how the world views him. And so, as part of the research we did for the game, it was really important to us to make that feel as authentic as possible so the player really understood what a man like Lincoln Clay would experience in 1968. And this is all part of the Mafia franchise. When we sat down to make Mafia 3, we identified some core pillars, and one of the biggest ones is that the Mafia series as a whole is about a specific time and place in American history and letting the player experience that. So Mafia, the first Mafia game is 1930s America, so obviously that's the Great Depression. Mafia 2 is post-war America primarily, after Vito gets out of jail. And Mafia 3 is set in New Bordeaux in 1968. And the time and place informs all aspects of these games. And just as it did for Mafia 2, it informs the kind of what's going on in the world and the setting of Mafia 3. So why Lincoln Clay? With the first 2 Mafia games, we'd already basically created and delivered on the traditional Mafia stories, especially the last one, the traditional kind of rags to riches. And Lincoln's very different from the traditional mobster, both because of his race and his background. Because he's African American, he has a specific, like I said before, he has a very specific way of viewing the world. And just as importantly, the world has a very specific way of viewing him. And that's something that we wanted to explore narratively, and it let us tell a very different type of mob story. And it also reinforces the time and place, because this game could only be set in New Bordeaux in 1968. So why 1968? Sorry, computer's a little slow. 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in American history. In fact, when people look back on the 60s and the kind of big watershed moments that happened in the 60s, more often than not, those events happened in 1968. So the assassination of Dr. King, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, there was the riots at the Democratic National Convention, there was the Mexico City power salute, the Tet Offensive, which is part of the Vietnam. That really signified a turn in the Vietnam War, because the North had never really mounted such a large offensive in that manner before. And then also social upheaval. Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, and in 1968 the Fair Housing part of the Civil Rights Act was passed. So there was still a lot of social upheaval between civil rights activists, people who wanted things the way they were, especially in the South. So why New Bordeaux? Sorry. So New Bordeaux is our version of New Orleans. And the great thing about New Orleans, at least in terms of our game, is New Orleans has a long history of organized crime. In fact, it was one of the first major American cities to have organized crime, specifically Italian Mafia. And it started a few years after the Civil War. The Union Army couldn't control the docks, so they actually hired a criminal to control the docks for them, and that was basically the initial gestation of organized crime. That continued all the way through the last century. In the 40s to the 60s, there was a man named Carlos Marcello, who's a larger-than-life mob figure. He was essentially the godfather of New Orleans, and he ran it. There's some amazing footage of him on YouTube, where he's testifying before Congress, and we have the Fifth Amendment. Basically, you can't self-incriminate. He literally takes the Fifth Amendment for every question, I think even including his age. New Orleans is an iconic aspirational city. So what we mean by that is, if you see a photo, like this is a shot from the game, but if you see a building like that, pretty much anyone in the world can make a guess, hey, that's from New Orleans. And it's aspirational in terms of, it seems like a fun place that players would want to drive a car through, run through, have gameplay in. And it also ties into the fact that everything that happens in the game feels like it could happen in a city like this. And then obviously the southern setting. This is a big part of it. We wanted to, since Lincoln Clay is African American, and we set it in 1968, it also made sense that we set it in the South, which was kind of the most turbulent area of that era. So in keeping with the Mafia franchise, there's always these kind of story wrappers outside of them. Mafia 2 is Vito's Letters. In this case, we decided to wrap it as a documentary. And that means it's footage from present day with Father James, reflecting back on the events of 1968. This is John Donovan testifying before a select Senate hearing in 1971. And so we use that entire thing as a framing device. The great thing about it is it helps ground the story in the real world, because intercut with the footage that we created, we actually licensed photos and video footage from Getty. So as you go through, you'll see photos of men in Vietnam, protests, footage of all the above. And it helps establish that the game is set in our world in 1968. And it's also for the writers out there, it's also a great way to deliver exposition. Documentaries are essentially Q&As. So it's very natural to ask a question and get an answer in that respect. So one of the biggest challenges that we face with the game is trying to what we called avoiding the soapbox. So as we developed the game, one of the most important questions we asked was, how do we infuse the game with events from that era, the protests, Vietnam War, civil rights movement, and racism, without it coming across like we were preaching from the proverbial soapbox. So the team had a lot of discussions about this, and in the end what we decided to do is address it across multiple disciplines. So although I was the lead writer on the game and my focus was primarily on narrative, it also fed into gameplay systems and things like that, which I'll discuss here in a second. And obviously, we also understood this was a big risk we were taking. If we got it wrong, we were going to get it really wrong, and we would not only do a disservice to everyone working on the game, but also to the people who lived in that era and experienced a lot of the things that Lincoln Clay experiences during the course of Mafia 3. So this is just what I'm going to run through now is a little bit of the research we did. This is primarily narrative focused, but every department working on the game did their own research. For example, art, they ordered a lot of old Sears catalogs off of eBay, and we used those. And the great thing about Sears back then is they literally sold everything. So it helps inform not only how people dressed, but also the furniture, the drapes, all those kind of things that show up in various scenes in over the course of the game. So the research we did kind of broke along these lines. There was documentaries, there was movies, books, including fiction and nonfiction, and then also first-hand accounts. So probably for me, the most kind of eye-opening and important documentary I watched is called Take This Hammer. There was a civil rights activist named James Baldwin, and he made this in 1963. And essentially what he does is he walks around San Francisco and he interviews African Americans about their lives. So that's literally all it is. And at the end, he has a little commentary about, the black experience in America. Spies of Mississippi is a documentary about the Mississippi state government trying to infiltrate civil rights groups and undermine them. And I don't know if it's still the case because of 9/11, but at the time it was actually the kind of largest spy organization that a state government had ever assembled. So it was really, really extensive. Mr. Untouchable, story of Nicky Barnes, who was a mob boss in New York City. Cocaine Cowboys. This is about, I don't know if anyone's seen it, it's on Netflix, it's amazing. It's about a man named John Roberts who basically single-handedly introduced cocaine to Miami. And although that really doesn't fit the time or place or even in some ways the tone of our game, it was really important because it just shows how crazy criminals can be. So basically it kind of gave us permission that no matter what the craziest stuff we could think of, he could top it. In terms of movies, it's kind of what you'd usually expect. American Gangster, which is about Frank Lucas, who is a contemporary of Nicky Barnes. Goodfellas, Godfather. And then since Lincoln is a Vietnam vet, it was important for us to look into that experience as well. So Platoon and Full Metal Jacket. For books, Matterhorn, even though it's fiction, it was written by a man who was a combat Marine in Vietnam. And I'd be amazed if a lot of it wasn't autobiographical. The Things They Carried by a man named Tim O'Brien. He won the National Book Award for another Vietnam novel called Going After Cacciato. And then in terms of criminality, the Parker novels by George Stark. I think the Mel Gibson movie Payback was based on one of them. They're amazing. And the novels of George V. Higgins, Friends of Eddie Coyle, and then another one called Coogan's Trade, which was turned into a movie with Brad Pitt called Killing Them Softly. American Desperado is actually the biography of John Roberts, the Cocaine Cowboys guy, and it's even more insane than the documentary. There's a moment where he has a bodyguard who's a semi-professional wrestler, and he gets into the guy's car, and there's this horrible odor, and he's trying to figure out what it is, and it turns out the guy had a body in the trunk, and he'd just totally forgotten about it. So when I say like the insanity of criminality, like imagine the world where you're the guy who forgets it's just such a everyday thing, you forget there's a body in the trunk. And then Double Deal is about a guy who's installed as the chief of police in a small town outside of Chicago by the mob. And what that really taught us is there's aspects of the game that include illegal gambling. And what it taught us is that the mob made an insane amount of money from illegal gambling. So again, that was an important part of our research. So first-hand accounts. This is what I'm going to put up here in a second is a quote from Jim Brown. This appeared in the February 1968 issue of Playboy magazine. He was interviewed by Alex Haley, who wrote Roots. And basically, the two of them spend the interview discussing what it's like to be an African-American man in America at the time. For those of you who don't know who Jim Brown was, I'm a Cleveland Browns fan. He played for them, so to me, he's the greatest football player ever. But he also went on to become an actor. And I'm just using this as an example. We actually got a lot of first-hand accounts from people. So I'll give you a second to read this. So what we did is, for a lot of these first-hand accounts that we did, sorry, I seem to have lost my mouse. What we did is, we looked at these not only as ways, how can we incorporate this into the narrative, but also into the gameplay systems. So this and other first-hand accounts like this help informed a lot of things in the game. So now I'll talk a little bit how we use history to inform the characters in the game, just using a handful of them. So what we did is, we didn't want the history of the period to define the characters, but we wanted to have it help inform them. So essentially what we did is, initially we'd figure out the character's narrative purpose. And at that point we would figure out what real-world history would mean to them and what their opinion of that would be. And then we'd use that to define various aspects of their characterization. Okay. So we wanted them to reflect the era. How does the era impact their beliefs? So the first one is Father James Ballard. He ran the orphanage that Lincoln Clay lived in up until about the age of 12. And we call him the, quote, angel on Lincoln's shoulder. The thing about Father James is in terms of how history informs him, he was part of a segregated unit that fought in World War II. And it was a real unit. They fought in this French town called Klimbach. They faced enormous odds. They were an anti-tank battalion, and I believe they had 4 anti-tank weapons. They lost 3 of them before the weapon started, and they still held the town. So they fought very heroically. They were highly decorated, but they were also segregated. So how does that feel, for men like him, how does it feel to fight for, ideas of freedom and democracy for a country that still segregates you in different units? That's also the reason he becomes a priest, is because he has a hard time dealing with the things that he not only saw, but that he did during the course of the war. And the way we use this over the course of the game is, we use him to comment not only on the race in America, but also on America itself. So for those of you who've played the game, there's 3 capos that you go after. There's 2 of them are Sal Marcano's brothers, one's his sister-in-law. And at the end of each one, we use the documentary to go to Father James in present day, where he reflects back on what Lincoln did, but also what America was then and what America is now. Then there's John Donovan. He's a CIA agent. Him and Lincoln team up in Vietnam. They run these things called provincial reconnaissance units. Basically, they do guerrilla warfare with indigenous people. If Father James is the angel on Lincoln's shoulder, Donovan is definitely the devil. Father James warns against Lincoln Clay, and by extension the player, of going too far, and basically becoming the thing you hate. Donovan's philosophy is kill them all, let God sort them out, essentially. The CIA, I'm sure it's changed now, but back then, again, this is an area where we used history to inform Donovan's origins. CIA agents back there tended to be East Coast elite. They went to Ivy League schools. They were white, they were Protestant, and they were generally recruited right out of college, and that's basically what happened to John Donovan. This is something that actually surprises me about the game. Donovan is violently anti-South. There's several times in the game where he talks about the Civil War, Reconstruction, how he wishes Andrew Johnson would have hanged all the traitors. But again, that's informed by history. Somebody who came from his background, say Connecticut, and went to Yale, he'd be a Yankee. That's how he would feel about things. The other thing that Donovan represents, in an odd way, because he actually works for the government, but the 60s kind of signal a shift in how Americans view the government. This is really when Americans really started to distrust their government and not buy into everything they're being told. And he represents that. He hates the cronies and the yes men who kind of man the levers of power. He hates hypocrites. And for those of you who play the game, his documentary section is, like I said before, is him testifying before a select Senate hearing on intelligence about what happened in New Bordeaux in 1968. And he absolutely loathes everyone in that room. So that's what that represents, is essentially they represent the government that he's grown to hate, even though he considers himself a patriot. Cassandra is one of the 3 underbosses that the player can recruit and ally with in their fight against Sal Marcano. She's an African-American militant who heads up the Haitian gang. That's who the player fights in what we call Act 1 of the game. And her primary focus is that the civil rights struggle is individualized. So she sees it on a ground level. She's not really concerned about national politics. She's concerned with what's going on in New Bordeaux in 1968. And you're either with her or you're against her. So she actually, even though Sammy was African-American, she actually views him as a traitor because he worked at the behest of a white mob figure, Sal. So to her eyes, that makes him a traitor. The other interesting thing about her is her opinion on guns. So she essentially wants to arm everyone in the Hollow, which is the predominantly African-American neighborhood of the city, so that they can defend themselves. The gun control movement in America really had its origins in preventing African Americans from having guns. So after the Civil War, they were legally prohibited from owning guns. And then in 1968, there was actually a gun control law passed that was, again, designed to restrict their access to weapons. It's also why in the game, when the player buys guns, they buy it from a guy driving a van. And the first time you call him, he actually tells you that the government shut down his store. This is Sal Marcano. He's the guy who betrays Lincoln. He's the primary antagonist in the game. And one of the things that you learn about him over the course of playing the game is he wants out of the life. He wants to go legit. And as a part of that, he wants to legalize gambling and build a Vegas-style casino north of the city. And the reason for that is that he understands that the world that he's kind of existed in is under siege. So the 60s, in a lot of ways, represented assaults on institutions. And the Italian Mafia was no different. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's an institution like any other. And he understands that not only is it under siege from outside forces, but also the type of criminals that are participating in these activities is changing. And that's represented by Lincoln Clay. And one of our big goals with the game is actually to show that, to show how Lincoln basically destroys the power of the traditional Italian Mafia and let the player be the one who essentially kind of pushes it over the edge. And it's also, historically, it marks the beginning of the end of the mob's golden age. Up until the Appalachian Conference, the FBI didn't even acknowledge that the Italian mob existed. And then once they did, J. Edgar Hoover started to apply, who's the director of the FBI, started to apply pressure on the Italian mob, which then creates openings for other criminals to come in. And that late 60s, this really starts to take effect, and then with the passage of the RICO Act in 1972, that was when things turned really bad for the mob. So the world. So as I mentioned earlier, the story is not about racism, and this was something we really held on to during development. It's the story of a man getting revenge on the Italian mob. But because of where the game is set and who the player character is, Lincoln Clay, and the year, obviously racism had to be part of that. So like I said before, the big question earlier was how do we expose 1968 to the player? Part of the way that we approached this was through our pedestrians. So this is actually a scene fairly early in the game. Those women in front of Lincoln are talking about the extradition of James Earl Ray. So we wrote hundreds of conversations, and they're scattered around the world. But one of the things we settled on is not every conversation could be about racism or Vietnam or social upheaval, because if it was, then none of it would mean anything. So a lot of those conversations, they discuss a wide range of topics. So some of them we actually did research into what the popular urban legends were in America in 1968, specifically in the South. So there's 3 or 4 of those conversations scattered throughout the game. My personal favorite is 2 guys talking about their best friend who had a heart attack in his pig pen, which is kind of for those of you who grew up in rural areas, it's kind of a joke. Never have a heart attack around pigs. And the goal is to make the city feel grounded. Because like I said, if literally everyone was yammering about how the world's going to hell, then it doesn't mean anything. So you kind of need to counterbalance that. We also have systemic lines, what we call systemic lines. So what these are is, as you play the game, as you walk down the street, if Lincoln bumps into somebody, what does that person say to him? How do they react to him? In some cases, the mere sight of him elicits a reaction. So as a part of that, this is where we had to include racist language in the game. And this goes back to the example of Jim Brown that I had before our first-hand accounts. Even though Lincoln's a big guy, and it seems weird that people will talk to him this way, Jim Brown is a very large man. And as that quote shows, it doesn't matter. There was this kind of implied superiority from whites to blacks. So but we didn't want to overload that. We wanted to make it feel natural. So what we did is we actually split it up based on how the section of the city that you were in. So if you were in Frisco Fields, which is a rich white area of town, the odds of you encountering racist language would be much higher than, say, Delray Hollow, which is where Lincoln is from. And the way we control that is we'd actually control which pedestrians were spawned into those areas. And what we did is as a part of that, we actually created mini biographies for each pedestrian. So that included everything, including bias, which is whether or not they're racist, their gender, their income level, and their sex. And then we created specific little mini biographies for each one of them. So we use these to inform the systemic lines, but also the conversations that I mentioned a second ago. So just real quick, here's an example of two biographies for upper-class white females. So again, this isn't something that we necessarily exposed to the players, but it really helped us in the writing because we had a starting point for each one of them, and then that informed not only who that character is, but it also helped us differentiate that pedestrian from another pedestrian. And we had a total of 38 pedestrian archetypes over the course of the game. The other thing is all the racially insensitive language in the game was on a timer, and that was universal across the game. So that applied to pedestrians, police, and also the Marcano's guys in the Dixie Mafia. So if any of those lines played, it'd be 10 minutes before another offensive line played. So before I move on to how we handled the police, just talk for a second about stores. So there's stores scattered throughout the game that you can go into. And essentially, these are divided up between segregated and desegregated. And despite the passage of the Civil Rights Act, that if you were, in this case, Southern store owners, like they kind of decided on a case-by-case basis who they wanted in their store because they were still trying to hold on to that. So if the store was desegregated, the owner of the store would welcome you, say hello, ask you if you needed help. There were some other greetings that were mixed in there. And then when you left, they would tell you goodbye. The player had to take an overt action against that store owner to elicit a negative response from them. In the case of segregated stores, they're immediately hostile. They basically use racist language, they tell you to leave. If you refuse, they then warn the player that they're going to call the police, and then if you still stick around, they actually do call the police. Speaking of the police, this is one thing that was discussed a lot about our game, and police in the open world games generally kind of act as a guardrail for the player. So as long as you're not doing anything, they basically pretend you don't exist. But if you suddenly pull out your gun and start doing things or driving crazy or attack them, that's when they respond. But as part of our, like I said before, as a part of our research into what it would be like to be Lincoln Clay in 1968 in the South, the thing is, the thing that differentiates our police from other police is that as soon as they see you, they are immediately suspicious of you, and they're watching you. We signify that, might be a little hard to see, but we have a blue icon that appears on the map, and it shows you that you're being watched, and it also shows the direction that you're being watched from. And we actually tie this in with something that was in the previous, in Mafia 2. So we have systemic police in the world. So we have them on foot and in cars. If you're walking by a guy who's on a foot patrol, for example, he acknowledges you with a systemic line. He'll tell you to watch watch yourself. He'll tell you that he's watching you. You better not do anything. Things like that. And if the player takes any action that could be perceived as committing a crime, they immediately attack you and try to use lethal force. And again, that was all with an eye toward trying to create an authentic gameplay experience to create that specific time and place where the game is set. Another part of this is the police dispatcher. So if you commit a crime anywhere in the city and a pedestrian sees you, they run to a payphone and they call it in. And this happens universally, the same speed. It doesn't matter where you're at because it doesn't matter who you are. You don't want crime in your neighborhood. However, the response differs by the section of the city you're in. So the police dispatcher essentially has kind of 3 response states: aggressive, neutral, and apathetic. So if you're in Frisco Fields, which is, again, the rich white part of town, the response is aggressive. And she describes the crime, and she says all units immediately go there, and the police show up really fast. If you commit something in Delray Hollow, which is where Lincoln comes from, it's apathetic, and she basically says, if anyone feels like it, go check it out. And we actually controlled, with the underlying police system, the response times from the police. So the player, you can actually tell the difference in how fast the police show up. And then the rest of the city is kind of defined by kind of socioeconomic status. So if you're in, like, say, River Row or Irish Point, which are poorer parts of the neighborhood, they're a little bit more toward the Frisco Fields end of thing. They remain apathetic, and then other sections are kind of neutral or aggressive. In terms of the enemies, we did the same thing with them that we did with pedestrians. So as you go through the hideouts, through the racket hideouts, or if there's this guy standing around, they have scripted conversations. And again, these are they run a wide spectrum from kind of slice of life things that are happening to them. Like there's one guy, he's telling his buddy that his daughter ran off with some hippies to San Francisco, to problems with their landlords, because we did that with an eye toward trying to humanize them a little bit. But they do also include racially charged language. So originally what we did, this is a little behind the scenes in terms of the process that we used for this. Initially, we basically were a little more liberal with the racist language that the enemies would use in their systemic lines. So it was very common to hear very racially charged language. But what we found when we started focus testing the group, focus testing the game, both internally and then also externally, is that it felt gratuitous and that it was just kind of noise and we were just doing it to do it. So what we did is we went through a process where we actually pulled a lot of that stuff out. So even though it'd probably be authentic to be in this situation and have guys like this say that, use that language directed at you, the thing we found with the players is that context was important. So what we did is we pulled a lot of it out of the systemic lines, and then we put it into the conversations, both ambient conversations that are around, and then occasionally conversations that the player or that Lincoln Clay is part of. The other thing we did is we limited that language to specific archetypes. So there's only 2 archetypes in case of Marcano's guys that use that language. And then with the Dixie Mafia, because they're basically a bunch of racist rednecks, they're racist across the board. And then, like I said, we adjusted all of this off of focus testing. We actually did a lot of focus testing on the game in that area. And like I said, it's just trying to get that balance between having it be still a fun experience for the player, but also having it feel authentic. So the radio, you spend a lot of time driving the car. I mean, it's kind of a standard of open world games set in a modern setting. So what we decided pretty early on is that we wanted to try to use the radio to actually expand the narrative and not just have it be, cool DJs and music. So we actually came up with 2 radio programs. One's called The Hollow Speaks, one's called Native Son. And they basically present differing opinions. So Hollow Speaks is by a guy named Charles Laveau, who I'll talk about in a second. And the other one's by a white developer named Remy Duval. And they really represent who those guys are. We also had a kind of B-plot in the game that starts off on the radio and then moves into a primary mission. And we call it the trial. And then also news. And this was I'll talk a little bit about this here in a second, but that was a mix of real-world news and also kind of in-game news that reflects the player's actions. So Hall Speaks, that's a picture of Charles Laveau. His nickname's The Voice. He's actually a main character in Faster Baby, our first DLC. He was inspired by Malcolm X and Robert F. Williams. Robert Williams actually ran a pirate radio station called Radio Free Dixie, I believe off of a boat for a long time. And unlike Cassandra, who sees civil rights as kind of a local, individualized struggle, he views it on a more national level. So he talks about the Vietnam War as it affects everybody, and he also tends to break things down along socioeconomic lines. So one of his broadcasts is, it's not just poor African Americans that are being sent to Vietnam, it's also poor white people. And then obviously he agitates against policies that target people of color and the poor. So Native Son, he was inspired by a man named William F. Buckley. And Remy is a wealthy land developer. So he's very charming. You know, he's Southern, so he has that Southern charm. But beneath it all, he's just essentially a snarling racist. In fact, he heads up the Southern Union, which is our version of the Klan. So he represents the views of Southern white America, and he agitates against change, and he uses a lot of coded language, like law and order, which is in America is pretty strongly coded language. Both of these guys, they started off initially on the radio, but then they intersect into the main game. So in the case of The Voice, he's the first contact you talk to when you're trying to take the hollow from the Dixie Mafia. He assists you with that. Remy is actually the landowner the land developer who's partnered with Sal Marcano to build the casino. And you actually confront him at a Southern Union rally. So again, it was trying to have these, what at first appear to be kind of external narrative threads that we then incorporated into the main game. The trial, this is primarily on the radio. There's two African-American men, Trey McCall and Lamont Harris. Their car breaks down in a white section of the city called South Downs. They go to a man's house asking for help, and he shoots both of them. And he actually is a guest on Remy's show. And his explanation is that he's heard what Lincoln Clay is doing, and he thought these guys were Lincoln Clay. So again, we're just trying to show a little bit of how the world would react to someone like Lincoln. Of course, at that point, things spin off. You know, there's a big question of whether or not he's going to be charged for murder. There's protests in-game outside the courthouse. Like I said, both radio programs and the news discuss this. And then even this comes into the main game. So you have Sal Marcano has a judge named Judge Holden in his pocket, and Judge Holden has agreed to rule on the legalization of gambling. He's also the judge presiding over the trial of Hollis Dupree. So there's actually a mission where you go after Judge Holden, and then the ramifications of that play out on the radio as well. In terms of the news, we wrote, I can't remember, it was like 140 real-world news stories. And those are a wide array of real-world events from 1968. So there's stories about the Tet Offensive, things going on in Vietnam, when Vince Lombardi, who is the coach of the Green Bay Packers, when he resigned. So it's a wide spectrum of kind of political, Vietnam, pop culture. It runs the entire gamut. And then we also have news that reflects what's happening in the game. So, for example, there's a mob boss named Tony DeRazio who Lincoln throws out of like the 28th story of a building. So there's a news story about that. Although there's spin to it where, you know, they don't say mobster Tony DeRazio, it's respected businessman Tony DeRazio. And that was just a way of trying to help the player feel agency and kind of help support and acknowledge the things that they've done over the course of the game. Which brings me to Faster Baby, which is our DLC, our first of 3 DLCs. The other 2 are called Stones Unturned and Sign of the Times. Faster Baby came out last Tuesday. It's set in an entirely new section of the city called Sinclair Parish. And you must help Charles Laveau, The Voice, and his daughter Roxy. They're trying to build a civil rights case against the sheriff of the parish, a man named Walter Slim Beaumont. And again, like a lot of other aspects of the game, this was inspired by history. So, in fact, our code name for this section of for the first DLC was actually Sundown County. So these were real things in America. Basically, if you were a person of color, there were certain towns that if you were there literally once the sun went down, you'd be verbally harassed, intimidated, physically assaulted, sometimes killed. And they would actually have signs on the roads leading to town saying, "This is a sundown city." And local law enforcement would enforce that. And it was so widespread that there's actually, for about 30 years, there was actually a thing called the Green Book, which was published annually. And basically it was a travel guide for African Americans, and it was for the entire United States. And it would break things down on a state level, city level, and sometimes a business level. So it would say, this town in this state is safe. You can go there and get a hotel room and spend the night. It might say, do not even go into this town. And then there might be other towns that were safe, but there were businesses within that town that you should not go to because you'd be verbally harassed or assaulted. But, we're still making a video game. It needs to be fun. So 1968-ish is also, the big muscle car era. Steve McQueen driving awesome cars, driving really fast. So the focus of Faster Baby is really trying to capture that. We released some free DLC back in December, which incorporated races. So we tried to take that to the next level, and we actually have driving missions, where there's just a lot of destructible objects in the world. We added some new vehicle combat options, all with an eye of trying to capture that flavor of the era, but also have it be as fun as it could be. And now we'll actually show you a trailer for Faster Baby.
Sinclair Parish. That mean anything to you?
Nothing good. For black folks, anyway.
Sheriff department down there still thinks Jim Crow's the law of the land.
Go on. Have your fun.
So we're building a civil rights case against them.
You know the names of the people we've been talking to. Some of these people done gone missing.
After it's all said and done, I'll probably get elected governor.
We gon' see about Slim and his friends.
The whole parish is locked down. No one gets in or out without Slim say so.
You still think you can win? But you got something to win.
We'll get this done.
Of that, I have no doubt.
Just one quick thing. We actually released a demo for the game last week on Tuesday, the same time as the DLC. And the DLC is available as a part of the season pass or for purchase individually. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for watching. That's all we have time for at the Rezzed 2017 Developer Sessions. We'll see you all in Birmingham in September for EGX, obviously, of course. Thanks very much for coming. Enjoy what you can of the rest of the show. It's going to close relatively soon, but get out there and have fun. Thanks again, and thanks again to Bill Harms for his fascinating talk. Thank you.